What happens when the young woman serving coffee at a billionaire's funeral reception discovers that the deceased was the father who abandoned her 25 years ago? Not just any abandonment, but one orchestrated by his wealthy wife who paid her mother to disappear and never contact them again. For Grace Chen, a 28-year-old waitress working double shifts to pay for her mother's cancer treatment, wealthy people's grief was just another backdrop to her exhausting routine. She poured their coffee, served their canapes, and listened to their eulogies while remaining invisible to their sorrow. But at tech mogul William Sterling's memorial service, a single photograph displayed among the tribute videos would change everything she thought she knew about her family. The man being mourned as a devoted husband and father had also been her father. The one her mother claimed had walked out on them when Grace was 3. And the Sterling family hadn't just stolen her father from her life. They had systematically destroyed every attempt he made to find his daughter. Now Grace faced an impossible choice: expose the truth and claim her rightful inheritance, or protect the family that had unknowingly raised her half-siblings while keeping her in poverty for 25 years. The Sterling mansion in Beverly Hills gleamed like a fortress of old Hollywood glamour, its Mediterranean architecture and perfectly manicured grounds serving as the backdrop for one of the most exclusive memorial services Los Angeles had seen in years. Tech billionaire William Sterling had died of a heart attack at 67, leaving behind an empire worth $12 billion and a family that commanded respect from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. Grace Chen adjusted her black serving uniform and checked her reflection in the chrome surface of the catering truck. At 28, she had perfected the art of invisible service, moving through crowds of wealthy mourners with practiced efficiency, while her own exhaustion remained hidden behind a professional smile. This was her 3rd funeral reception this month. Elite events, catering specialized in high-end memorial services where the grieving rich needed their sorrow properly accessorized with champagne and imported delicacies. The Sterling family sat in the front row of the mansion's great room, accepting condolences with the composed dignity that money could buy. Victoria Sterling, the 62-year-old widow, was elegant in her grief, wearing a black Chanel suit and pearls that had probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months. Beside her sat their children, Amanda Sterling Walsh, 35, a successful architect who had inherited her father's business acumen, and Michael Sterling, 30, who ran the family's charitable foundation. Grace had been working these events for 5 years, ever since her mother Chen Wei had been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. The medical bills had consumed their savings within months, and Grace had dropped out of her nursing program to work full-time. Elite events paid better than most service jobs, and the wealthy clientele tipped well when they remembered to acknowledge the staff at all. "Grace, we need more coffee service in the library," called Janet Morrison, the head caterer. "The family's doing private condolences in there." Grace loaded her tray with fresh coffee and pastries, making her way through the crowd of tech executives, politicians, and entertainment industry moguls who had come to pay their respects. The conversations were a mix of genuine grief and networking opportunities. Even death couldn't stop the machinery of wealth and influence in Los Angeles. The library was quieter than the main reception area, with smaller groups of mourners, sharing more intimate memories of William Sterling. Grace moved between them efficiently, refilling cups and clearing plates while trying not to intrude on private conversations. It was while she was serving coffee near the memorial display that Grace saw it, among the dozens of photographs showing William Sterling's life, his Harvard graduation, his wedding to Victoria, the births of his children, the growth of his tech empire, was one image that made Grace's world tilt on its axis. It was a candid shot, clearly taken in the early 1990s based on the clothing and photo quality. William Sterling, looking much younger with dark hair instead of the silver she recognized from recent news photos, was sitting on a park bench. In his arms was a small Asian child, maybe 2 or 3 years old, with pigtails and a bright smile. Behind them stood a young Asian woman in a simple sundress, her hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. Grace recognized the woman immediately, despite the passage of 25 years. It was her mother, Chen Wei, looking impossibly young and happy in a way Grace had never seen her. And the child in William Sterling's arms was unmistakably Grace herself. The coffee pot slipped from Grace's numb fingers, crashing to the marble floor in an explosion of ceramic and hot liquid. The sound echoed through the library, causing every conversation to stop as mourners turned to stare at the clumsy waitress who had disrupted their grief. "I'm so sorry," Grace stammered, dropping to her knees to clean up the mess with napkins from her apron. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely gather the broken pieces. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean this up right away." "Are you all right, dear?" Victoria Sterling had approached, her voice carrying the kind of concerned authority that came naturally to women who had spent decades managing social situations. Grace looked up from the floor to find herself staring into the face of the woman who had been married to her father for 30 years. Victoria's expression was politely sympathetic, but there was no recognition in her eyes, no awareness that she was looking at her late husband's daughter. "I'm fine, Mrs. Sterling," Grace managed to say. "Just tired. I'm very sorry for your loss." Victoria nodded graciously and moved away, already focused on other guests. But Grace remained frozen on the floor, surrounded by coffee-stained carpet and broken ceramic, staring up at the photograph that had just shattered her understanding of her own life. William Sterling hadn't abandoned his family when Grace was 3, as her mother had always claimed. He had been there, holding his daughter, looking at Chen Wei with obvious love and affection. The story Grace had grown up believing, that her father was a deadbeat who had walked out on them, was a lie. But if William Sterling had loved them, what had happened? Why had Grace grown up in a tiny apartment in Koreatown while her father built a tech empire worth billions? Why had her mother struggled as a seamstress while her father's legitimate children grew up in mansions and attended private schools? Grace finished cleaning up the spilled coffee in a daze, her mind reeling with questions that demanded answers. She had to know the truth about her family, about the father who had apparently been stolen from her life. The rest of the memorial service passed in a blur. Grace went through the motions of serving and cleaning, but her attention was fixed on the Sterling family. She studied Amanda and Michael Sterling, looking for any resemblance to herself, any sign that they shared the same father. The bone structure was there, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes. These weren't just random rich people she was serving. They were her half-siblings. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Grace found herself alone in the library with the memorial display. She quickly took pictures of the photograph with her phone, focusing on the image of her younger self with the father she had never known she had. "Excuse me?" a voice said behind her. Grace spun around to find Michael Sterling standing in the doorway, his expression curious rather than accusatory. "You're with the catering company, right?" "Yes, sir," Grace replied, quickly putting her phone away. The display is beautiful. Your father seemed like a wonderful man." Michael approached the memorial wall, his eyes settling on the same photograph that had devastated Grace. "He was," he said softly, "though there are parts of his life I'm only now learning about." Grace's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Michael picked up the photograph Grace had been studying. "This one appeared in a box of Dad's personal effects that we found in his private office. Mum says she's never seen it before. She doesn't know who the woman and child are." "Maybe they were just friends," Grace suggested, though her voice sounded hollow even to herself. Michael shook his head. My father kept very few personal photographs in his private space. Everything there was important to him, this woman and this little girl. He looked at Grace more closely. You know, the little girl looks a bit like you, same bone structure. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Could Michael see the resemblance? Did he suspect something? I should get back to work, Grace said quickly. The cleanup isn't finished. But as she tried to leave, Michael caught her arm gently. What's your name? Grace, she replied automatically. Grace Chen. Michael's expression changed immediately. Chen, he repeated slowly. Your last name is Chen. Grace nodded, confused by his reaction. Michael looked from her face to the photograph in his hand, then back again. Grace Chen, he said quietly. My father had a safe deposit box we found after he died. The key was labeled Grace Chen. We haven't opened it yet because we couldn't figure out who that was. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. William Sterling had kept a safe deposit box with her name on it. Even after 25 years of separation, even after whatever had torn their family apart, he had maintained some connection to his lost daughter. I think, Michael said carefully, we need to have a very long conversation. 2 hours later, Grace found herself in the Sterling family's private study, facing Victoria, Amanda, and Michael Sterling, across a mahogany table that had probably cost more than Grace made in a year. The memorial guests were gone, the caterers had finished cleaning up, but Grace had been asked to stay. Victoria Sterling's earlier warmth had been replaced by a cold calculation that made Grace understand why this woman had succeeded in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley society. Amanda sat rigidly beside her mother, clearly uncomfortable with whatever revelations were about to unfold. Michael had the look of someone who had suspected family secrets but never imagined their scope. Before we begin, Victoria said, her voice carefully controlled, I want you to understand that whatever you think you know, whatever claims you might make, this family will protect itself. I'm not making any claims, Grace replied quietly. I just want to understand what happened to my family. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Your family? Let me tell you about your family, Miss Chen. She opened a manila folder and spread documents across the table. Bank records, legal agreements, private investigator reports. Grace recognized her mother's signature on several of the papers. 25 years ago, Victoria continued, your mother was William's secretary at his first tech startup. She was young, pretty, and married to another man. But that didn't stop her from pursuing my husband or from using her pregnancy to try to destroy our marriage. Grace felt a surge of anger. That's not true. My mother wouldn't. Your mother, Victoria interrupted coldly, threatened to go public with her affair and her pregnancy unless William left me and our children. She wanted him to abandon his family for her and her bastard child. I'm not a bastard, Grace said, her voice trembling with rage. And my mother isn't a gold digger. She's worked 2 jobs my entire life just to keep us afloat. Victoria slid a check across the table. It was dated 25 years ago, made out to Chen Wei, for the amount of $500,000. Your mother took $500,000 to disappear from our lives forever, Victoria said triumphantly. She signed a non-disclosure agreement promising never to contact William again, never to reveal his paternity, and never to make any claim on the Sterling family assets. Grace stared at the check, her world crumbling. Her mother had taken money to abandon Grace's father. Everything she had been told about her father leaving them was a lie. It was her mother who had taken the money and run. But, Victoria continued, enjoying Grace's obvious pain, your mother violated that agreement multiple times over the years. William kept getting letters, phone calls, emails. She would send photos of you, report cards, medical bills. She kept trying to re-establish contact, claiming she needed help with your expenses. Grace's confusion deepened. If her mother had, Been trying to contact William Sterling for years. Why had Grace never known about it? Why had her mother maintained the story that Grace's father had abandoned them? Michael reached into the folder and pulled out a thick stack of letters. "These were in Dad's private files," he said gently. "All from your mother, all returned unopened." Grace took the letters with trembling hands. They were addressed to William Sterling at various business addresses, all in her mother's careful handwriting. The postmarks spanned 25 years, with the most recent dated just 6 months before William Sterling's death. "He never read them," Grace whispered. "I wouldn't let him," Victoria said flatly. "The agreement was clear. Your mother had no right to contact him after taking the money. I made sure his assistants were instructed to return any correspondence from Chen Wei." The full scope of the betrayal was becoming clear. Grace's mother hadn't abandoned William Sterling for money. She had been forced to choose between her daughter's financial security and her relationship with Grace's father. And then, when she tried to maintain contact over the years, Victoria had systematically intercepted every attempt. Grace had grown up poor and fatherless, not because her mother was greedy or her father was heartless, but because Victoria Sterling had constructed a wall of money and legal threats that kept the family separated. "Why?" Grace asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why keep us apart? He was my father." Victoria's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Because you would have destroyed everything we built. William was a brilliant man, but he was sentimental. If he had stayed in contact with you, he would have wanted to be a real father. That would have meant dividing his attention, his resources, his legacy. Amanda and Michael would have had to share their inheritance with the daughter of a secretary. So, you stole my father from me to protect your children's inheritance." "I protected my family," Victoria replied unapologetically. "Just as any mother would." Grace looked at Amanda and Michael, seeing her half-siblings clearly for the first time. Amanda was staring at her hands, obviously uncomfortable with her mother's revelations. Michael was studying Grace's face with growing recognition and what looked like guilt. "The safe deposit box," Grace said to Michael. "What was in it?" Michael exchanged glances with his mother, then pulled out another folder. "College fund contributions," he said quietly. "Dad had been setting aside money for your education every year since you were born. There's almost $2 million in there." Grace felt the air leave her lungs. While she had been working multiple jobs to pay for her mother's medical bills, while she had dropped out of nursing school because she couldn't afford tuition, her father had been quietly saving money for her education, money that Victoria had prevented him from giving her. "There's more," Michael continued, ignoring his mother's warning glare. "Dad hired private investigators to keep track of you and your mother over the years. He knew about Mom's cancer diagnosis. He knew you had dropped out of school to work. He wanted to help, but I wouldn't let him," Victoria finished, "because helping you would have opened the door to a relationship that could have destroyed our family's stability." Grace stood up abruptly, overwhelmed by 25 years of suppressed grief and rage. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You had no right to make that choice for him or for me. He was my father, and you stole him from me." Victoria remained unmoved. "And what would you have us do now? Welcome you into the family with open arms? Share the sterling fortune with a waitress who grew up in Koreatown? You don't understand our world, Grace. You don't belong in it." The words were meant to wound, and they did. But they also crystallized something in Grace's mind. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about recognition, about acknowledgement, about justice for the father she had never been allowed to know. "Maybe I don't belong in your world," Grace said, standing to leave. "But William Sterling was my father, and nothing you say can change that." As she walked toward the door, Amanda Sterling spoke for the first time since the revelations had begun. "Grace," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened." To you," Grace nodded without turning around. The apology was sincere, but it couldn't restore 25 years of lost time or heal the wound of growing up believing her father hadn't wanted her. As Grace left the Sterling mansion that night, she knew her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a struggling waitress trying to care for her sick mother. She was the secret daughter of one of America's most powerful families, and she had evidence to prove it. The question now was what she was going to do with that truth. Grace spent the following week in a daze, going through the motions of her normal routine while her mind processed the devastating revelations from the Sterling mansion. She worked her shifts at 2 different restaurants, visited her mother in the hospital during chemo treatments, and tried to figure out what her next move should be. The hardest part was looking at her mother, Chen Wei, with new eyes. The woman Grace had always admired for her strength and sacrifice had kept the truth about Grace's father hidden for 25 years. Every story about the deadbeat father who had abandoned them was a lie designed to protect Grace from the painful reality that they had been bought off and then systematically excluded from William Sterling's life. "Ma," Grace said during one of their hospital visits, "I need to ask you something about my father." Chen Wei's expression immediately became guarded. Even weakened by chemotherapy, she retained the wariness that had become her default response to questions about Grace's paternity. "Grace, you know there's nothing to talk about. Your father left before you could walk. He wanted nothing to do with us." Grace pulled out the photograph from William Sterling's memorial service, watching her mother's face crumble as she recognized the image of their lost family. "His name was William Sterling," Grace said quietly. "And he didn't abandon us. You took money to disappear from his life." Chen Wei began to cry, not the gentle tears Grace was used to seeing during her mother's moments of pain, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from 25 years of buried guilt and grief. "I had no choice," Chen Wei whispered through her tears. His wife. "She said she would destroy us both if I didn't take the money and leave. She had lawyers, private investigators. She said she would make sure I never worked again, that you would be taken away from me." Grace took her mother's frail hand, understanding finally dawning. "She threatened to take me away." Chen Wei nodded miserably. "Victoria Sterling was powerful, wealthy. I was just a secretary with a green card and a baby. She could have done anything she wanted to us. The money. I took it to protect you, to make sure we could survive without William. But you tried to contact him over the years. I saw the letters. I hoped that maybe when you got older, when you needed help with school or medical bills, I thought he might help his daughter even if he couldn't acknowledge me." Chen Wei's voice broke completely. "I never knew his wife was intercepting everything. I thought he just didn't care." Grace felt a new wave of rage at Victoria Sterling's systematic cruelty. Not only had she separated a father from his daughter, but she had let both sides believe the other didn't care. William Sterling had died thinking his daughter's mother had taken his money and disappeared forever. Chen Wei had spent 25 years thinking the father of her child had abandoned them both. "Ma," Grace said gently, "he set aside money for my education, almost $2 million. He never stopped caring about us." Chen Wei stared at her daughter, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. He remembered you. He kept our photo in his private office. He hired people to keep track of us. He wanted to help, but Victoria Sterling wouldn't let him." For the first time since her cancer diagnosis, Chen Wei smiled. "He loved you," she whispered. "Even after all these years, he loved his little girl." They held each other in the sterile hospital room. Two women who had been manipulated and separated from the man they both loved by someone who saw them only as threats to her family's wealth and status. But Grace's newfound understanding of her family history also came with a terrible weight of responsibility. She was William Sterling's daughter, with all the legal rights that entailed. The safe deposit box with her college fund was just the beginning. As his child, she was entitled to a portion of his estate. The Sterling family's $12 billion empire should rightfully be shared with Grace. The question was whether she had the courage to fight for what was legally hers, knowing it would mean destroying the peace of mind of her half-siblings who had done nothing wrong except be born into the right family. Grace's decision came when she received her mother's latest medical bill. The cancer had metastasized despite the chemotherapy, and Chen Wei would need experimental treatments that their insurance wouldn't cover. The costs would easily exceed $200,000, money Grace had no way of obtaining. Her father had left her $2 million for education. Surely he would have wanted her to use his money to save her mother's life. Grace contacted a probate attorney, specializing in inheritance disputes, bringing with her the photograph, the letters her mother had sent, and documentation of the safe deposit box. The lawyer, Patricia Morgan, reviewed everything with the careful attention of someone who had seen many families destroyed by money and secrets. "You have a strong case," Morgan told Grace after reviewing the evidence. "DNA testing will prove paternity, and the safe deposit box shows clear acknowledgement of the relationship. You're entitled to a significant portion of the estate." "How much?" Morgan calculated quickly. "California law would give you at least 25% of everything, possibly more depending on how the courts interpret your father's intentions. We're talking about $3 billion minimum." The number was so large it felt meaningless to Grace. She had been worried about paying for her mother's medical bills, and now she was potentially one of the richest women in America. But Morgan continued, "The Sterling family will fight this with everything they have. They'll claim your mother was a gold digger, that the relationship was purely transactional, that William Sterling never intended to include you in his estate. Planning. It will be a long, expensive, and very public battle." Grace thought about Amanda and Michael Sterling, who had seemed genuinely apologetic about their family's treatment of her. Did she really want to drag them through a media circus that would expose all their family's secrets? "What if I don't want the full inheritance?" Grace asked. "What if I just want enough to pay for my mother's medical treatment and maybe finish my nursing degree?" Morgan looked surprised. "You'd be walking away from billions of dollars." "The money won't bring my father back," Grace said quietly, "but it could save my mother's life." 2 weeks later, Grace found herself once again in the Sterling family's study, but this time she wasn't alone. Patricia Morgan sat beside her, along with a forensic accountant and a private investigator who had verified every detail of Grace's story. Victoria Sterling had assembled her own army of lawyers, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA testing had confirmed that Grace was William Sterling's daughter, and the safe deposit box proved he had been supporting her financially even while being prevented from having a relationship with her. "What do you want?" Victoria asked, her earlier composure replaced by barely controlled desperation. Grace looked at her half-siblings, then back at the woman who had stolen her father from her. "I want my mother's medical bills paid. I want the money from the college fund to cover her treatments. And I want a written acknowledgement that William Sterling was my father." Victoria stared at her in disbelief. "That's it? You're not claiming inheritance rights?" "I'm not interested in destroying your family," Grace said firmly, "but I won't let my mother die when my father left money specifically to help me." Michael Sterling leaned forward. "Grace, you're entitled to much more than that. Dad would have wanted you to have a real share of what he built." Grace shook her head. Your father missed 25 years of my life because your mother was protecting her family. I'm not going to make that same mistake. I just want to save my mother and move on with my life." The legal settlement was completed within a month. Grace received the full contents of the college fund, enough to cover her mother's experimental treatments and allow Grace to return to nursing school. The Sterling family provided a private acknowledgement of Grace's paternity, satisfying her need for official recognition without creating a public scandal. Most importantly, Victoria Sterling was required to provide Grace with copies of all the letters her mother had sent over the years. 25 years of correspondence that showed a woman desperately trying to maintain contact with the father of her child. Grace read every letter to her mother during Chen Wei's recovery from her successful cancer treatment. They were love letters in their own way. Not romantic love, but the deep affection of a woman who wanted her daughter to know her father and who hoped that William Sterling still cared about the family he had been forced to abandon. "He kept them," Chen Wei whispered, tears in her eyes as Grace read a letter from Grace's 10th birthday. "He kept every one." "He loved us, Ma," Grace replied. "He just couldn't find a way back to us." Grace used her inheritance to finish nursing school, specializing in oncology to help other families facing the same battles her mother had fought. She established a small foundation, providing financial assistance to low-income cancer patients, naming it the Sterling Chen Foundation, in honor of both her parents. She maintained cordial but distant contact with her half-siblings. Amanda sent Christmas cards, and Michael occasionally invited Grace to family gatherings, but Grace politely declined. She had found peace in knowing the truth about her father, but she didn't need to become part of a world that had rejected her for 25 years. On the anniversary of William Sterling's death, Grace visited his grave for the first time. She brought flowers and the photograph from his memorial service, the image of their lost family that had started her journey to the truth. "I wish we could have known each other," Grace said to the marble headstone, "but I understand why you couldn't find a way back to us. I hope you knew that we never stopped loving you." And as she walked back to her car, Grace reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from invisible waitress to secret heiress to independent woman at peace with her past. She had discovered that her father was a billionaire, but the real treasure had been learning that he had never stopped loving her. The waitress's inheritance hadn't made her wealthy, it had made her whole. This story reminds us that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but truth and understanding. Grace's choice to seek justice without revenge shows us that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing we were loved, even when circumstances kept us apart from those who cared about us. What would you have done in Grace's situation? Would you have claimed your full inheritance, or would you have chosen a different path? Have you ever discovered that a family story you believed your whole life wasn't the complete truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of family secrets, difficult choices, and ultimately choosing love over money resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with friends who understand that knowing the truth about our families can be worth more than any fortune. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about the power of family bonds and the courage to seek justice. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the people serving you coffee at life's most important moments are fighting battles and carrying secrets you could never imagine. Never underestimate the strength it takes to choose forgiveness over revenge.